Hi, and welcome to WTF, Women Talk Finance. This is the start of Season 2. We've taken the show on the road, and today we are in Las Vegas. Our guest today is local Las Vegas attorney and community organizer, Athar Haseebullah. Athar is the first person of color to lead the ACLU of Nevada since its founding in 1966. He most recently served as general counsel and director of strategic initiatives for Opportunity 180, which is a Nevada nonprofit focused on improving education quality in Nevada. Prior to his tenure with Opportunity 180, Athar served as the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada's Senior Government Affairs and Legal Administrator. He also spent several years as a litigator for both Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada and the City of New York. Athar is a graduate of Howard University and Howard University School of Law. He is a practicing Muslim whose parents immigrated to the United States from Pakistan. Welcome, Athar. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's get right into your background. How did you end up here at the ACLU Nevada?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and excited to be with you all to share a little bit of information about me and my org today and the great work that our team does. So I grew up here in Las Vegas. I would describe my growing up experiences here. I'm mid-30s, but our experiences growing up here were a little bit unorthodox, primarily because there's not a lot of people that have my demographic background in the state. And Vegas used to be really small as a community. I remember when the confines of what was viewed as Las Vegas only extended to Russell and areas that the one we're in right now simply didn't exist, right? So it was much, much smaller. But grew up here. What really kind of ended up getting me involved and integrated with social justice work as a whole was in large part 9/11. So we went overnight from being a very unknown group in the Muslim American community. And I think folks, if they stereotype me at the time and now, would probably correctly assume what my background is, at least in part, maybe not ethnically, but religiously. So 9/11 overnight sort of changed a lot for us. My mosque ended up having, I spoke English probably the best at my mosque. We had a large immigrant contingency, and so I was 14. And I remember checking voicemails, and the voicemails the week after 9/11 were shocking. We had experienced racism and things like that before, but it was never to that level where you tune in and you listen to voicemails and you're the one recording the message as a kid. And you hear things like, we're going to show up to you guys are traitors. We're going to show up to your building and burn it down. We're going to rape every woman in there and cover your body in blood of pigs and things of that nature. And so it was kind of a shock, but really around the same time, I would have hoped that my experiences would have been limited to those types of experiences. They weren't. My first time that I was detained by law enforcement, I was 16, just a couple years later. And that incident, there was a drunk white dude at a local gas station here. I won't put the name out, but he was clearly intoxicated, called me sand N-word, and pushed me. I pushed him back. When I pushed him back, he fell. I guess the store clerk had called the police at the time, or they may have been nearby. They were there pretty quickly, and I ended up getting detained. And when I asked why the hell I was being detained, I was told that I was the aggressor in the incident. That was one of the first detentions I've had. Unfortunately, I wish it was the only one, but it wasn't. So I ended up going to college and law school away in DC, specifically at Howard, to be able to engage in civil rights work, so I could work with communities that have faced the same. I didn't know I wanted to be a lawyer. The recession happened. That kind of prompted a lot of us to change our educational path. So I ended up going to law school, and after a stint in New York, where I was a prosecutor there and also wrongfully detained twice there as well, ended up moving back to Vegas in 2015, took a series of different positions, but I've always been really involved in community work. I only wanted to be a lawyer for a day, just to say that I did it, because that was the loftiest career aspiration I had set for myself, was if I just do it for a day, then I've done it. So I can check it off my internal bucket list. But all these years later, now I'm here, and I've been at the ACLU heading it for the state for almost 3 years now, and we've done a lot of great work. So no regrets there, but it has been a weird journey to get here.
Thank you for sharing that, because that was really raw. And I think I did not, also growing up in Nevada, it's a little bit of an isolating state. That's an incredible story to share, your origin story and how you got to, your ACLU superpower is mind-blowing, right? For those who aren't familiar, give an overview of ACLU as an organization, what its purpose is, maybe a little bit of the history. I think for most people, they only see ACLU maybe in the news. So give us maybe your take on ACLU.
Yeah. So ACLU stands for American Civil Liberties Union. We're a nationwide organization. I say a nationwide organization intentionally. I don't say a national organization because we're federated, which means that every state affiliate kind of controls its own destiny. We work with our national organization. We have a national organization as well that allows us things like resources and thought partnership and collaboration on different initiatives, but we kind of set our own agendas in each of the states. Our single goal is to advance civil liberties and civil rights for all people within whatever location we're working. For me, that means everyone in the state of Nevada. And civil liberties refer to individual rights that emanate from things like the Constitution or from state law. Civil rights, I always use the words together because civil rights allowed those civil liberties to be applicable to all of us. It didn't exclude the same groups that were once excluded. And so from my vantage point, it would be strange just to talk about civil liberties and not talk about civil rights because they were never originally intended to apply to people like me or to people like you. So they go hand in hand. Why is that important? Because constantly our rights are subject to attack. And that's across the country. Every state and every place has different issues. In Nevada, we work on a slew of those issues. And the way that we do our work comes through a threefold approach. It's an integrated advocacy approach using 3 different prongs. We use public education and communication, whether that means we're engaging in mass media. Oftentimes people will know us through the news because somebody will shout, "I'm calling the ACLU." And that'll be one way it happens. But we also do things like cultivate and create mentorship programs, which we started recently here in Nevada with the first of its kind, where we have a youth program for those between 16 and 22 that's designed to give them leadership experience and professional development experience with a civil rights twist. They may not want to be lawyers. It's not only for lawyers, it's for people of any background. But the real focus for us is creating leaders for tomorrow, regardless of what their background is and what sector they're interested in working in long term. The second way we do our work is through policy work. We lobby or advocate. That's another word. So for anybody that thinks that lobbying is a dirty word, it can be, but it also doesn't have to be. So we lobby or we advocate at the local, state, and federal levels. It could be something as small as a bad school board proposal that we're trying to stop from happening, or it could be something as sweeping as trying to pass an initiative statewide like the Equal Rights Amendment, or at the federal level doing the same thing. The third way that we do our work, which is maybe the best known way we do our work, is litigation. And so that means we'll engage in lawsuits where we think there's a systemic impact. Now, something that separates our work from other organizations' work is we're not a legal aid or legal service provider in the same way where someone has an issue, you pop over to the ACLU, you get assigned a free attorney, and then you get your benefit at the end of the day and you go about your way. Our focus is impact litigation. And so what we do is we develop on our end the approach, the concept for what areas or policies we're attempting to attack, or go after, or advance. We're often able, as a result of those, we'll have insight as to what the community wants, which is why that community work becomes so important. Like we have to have a pulse on those issues. We end up finding individuals or organizations that are impacted by those policies, and then they often end up becoming our plaintiffs afterwards, our petitioners, and so we sue on their behalf. I'll only ever take a case where the government or government policy is on the other end of the issue, and it has to be an issue where there's a systemic impact that runs the gamut. we don't focus on one type or one area of civil rights protections or civil liberties protections. We focus on all areas, but they have to be systemic issues. Because we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, we don't have the same types of agreements that other law firms do. We don't get a cut of what our clients might end up receiving. So our motivation is probably different. We don't look at what's going to make us the most amount of money. That'd be a goofy model for the ACLU to have, right? We look at what the biggest outcome and impact is that we can have on this particular community. And it's not always without challenges because we cover the entire state. And as you all know, we have a big state. It's actually like multiple states really combined into one. It's hard to explain the differences sometimes between Clark and Washoe and all the rurals. And you have hundreds of miles spanning in between our two biggest urban environments. And so it poses its challenges, but we work statewide. I have a team statewide in each of these three areas, and we cover issues across the state. We get to work alongside a really great board of directors who are volunteers for our organization. And we have a lot of community-based support. A lot of that comes, though, as a result of the fact that most of what we do is press-worthy. So we end up getting a lot of coverage for the stuff we're engaged in. We can also speak freely. I'm not a politician, so I can say whatever the hell I want, right? There's no recourse at the end of the day. I'm not running for anything, so I don't have to be scared or consider the same impact that sometimes elected officials or politicians do. We can be authentic and truthful about what those issues are. There's a lot of misconceptions about our work. And we have a lot of haters too, right? But like our haters keep us going. We work on behalf of them as well. And so we're always willing to engage them at the same time.
It's interesting you just used the word scared, that some people are scared about your work. When you were telling your story, I think it's commendable. You said community matters to you, and you are from Las Vegas. You left after those incidents occurred to you to go be educated in DC intentionally, and you came back here to your home, to your community where those incidents happened. So rather than being scared, it's like you used this emotional drive and you're like, I'm going to go do something about it. So we began with the premise that, in our opinion, this is season one, we started out talking about how women don't talk about money or finances the way men tend to do. And so we started to encourage listeners to educate themselves on financial issues and how it affects their lives. And the podcast quickly evolved, talking about not only finances, but capital and social capital and different types of capital. And I would argue that one thing you're doing with I want to call it your story, right? With your origin story, I think, Candace, is the phrase you used. You're turning that into your capital for change. And I think, so the podcast evolved into a lot of women telling their stories about their career path, but this is a really timely and important conversation about what you're doing, and it ties in so closely to what we value. So thank you for sharing that. And I think talking about your work and talking about the ACLU with our listeners and just making them aware of the organization, having this new lens on it, we can get rid of some of the fear. This is nothing to be scared about, right? That's my opinion.
Yeah, I'd also add to that same point. I think a lot of times, because, my approach is, I'll admit, my approach is sometimes abrasive when it needs to be, but you have to be. There's a lot of people that are getting bullied, and generally what that ends up looking like is they're bullied through policy, whether that means it's a corporate policy that permits it, a government policy that permits it, or something else. There's a lot of people that are simply afraid. The amount of complaints we've got in over time is just shocking here, but it's been that way throughout my entire legal career. The first case I ever took as a student attorney when I was in the civil rights clinic at Howard, I was actually, oddly enough, under the supervision of an ACLU attorney who worked for the ACLU of Maryland, who's now a federal magistrate. And so, but he was my supervisor in the clinic, so it kind of came full circle. The very first case I took was actually a woman police officer in DC, and she was denied a promotion based on gender discrimination within the police department. So I always think it's interesting too, because there's this rep that we get for being anti-police or, anti this or anti that. Really, we're not anti anything. We're here to advance the rights of those that don't have them. And our approach might be different. We think that things like the justice system should be smarter, not quote unquote tougher. And I don't think that's really that controversial of a position. I don't think police officers should be deployed to calls alone when there's a domestic, like a family incident where a parent and child have had a disagreement. I don't think the police want that either. I don't think people should be going to prison for marijuana convictions or for marijuana offenses when cannabis has been legalized in the state under the Constitution, which is part of the reason we sued last year to have it descheduled and try to get in a pathway to being able to reverse those convictions, because you're having businesses that are profiting off it. And then on the back end of it, we're seeing people disproportionately punished as a result of it. So it's about bringing stability and common sense to a lot of these solutions. But I think a lot of times people will run with a politically volatile and kind of boogeyman type of narrative rather than just focusing on what's practical and what's pragmatic and what advances the rights and interests of all those in our community.
Well, and you said, I mean, the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization. However, it seems it is weaponized in the political game that we all are party to seemingly all the time. I mean, it seems like we end one election and we're kind of in the midst of the next one. And so the ACLU definitely seems to be put in a spot that it's polarized. So without that narrative that's coming at us, can we get a, current state from your perspective of women's rights, of, equality, of gender equality, not from the 10-second snippets we get from whatever sway? Because at the end of the day, what the ACLU stands for, we want, you said it really well, you are here to protect everyone's civil liberties.
Yeah, even those that I disagree with, right? Even those that I view their views as anathematic to what our positions are and to what society should be. We still even represent those folks' rights. And most often that comes up in the context of their First Amendment rights. Unfortunately, we do live in a society that is politically toxic. And it's why I enjoy the work that we do, because we don't have to muddy ourselves by doing it. We push for accountability between Republicans and Democrats. Now, I do think that, I'll say this as a professional and a personal opinion, I think that the current state of the Republican Party across the country has veered off the deep end, and they've drifted into a lane that most folks who are practical are uncomfortable with at this point. There are positions to take on certain issues that I think for many, many years, especially on the economic front, voters and people generally appealed to because they were economically driven and they viewed it as deregulation was a great thing. I'm one of the folks that's a supporter of deregulation in many of those aspects. It's kind of shifted from there into this culture war argument. And when you start getting into culture war arguments, that's when a lot of division starts to ensue, because it's driven by the concept of personal morality. And morality and what's right and wrong is largely arbitrary, regardless of whether or not people think, how can you say that? You work for the ACLU? No, it is arbitrary. It's a fact that morals and values in that way are arbitrarily defined. There is no guarantee. There's not going to be an agreement there. But I think along that, when we're looking at the state right now of gender equity and things like that, things are really rough. For years, there was a push to end discrimination across the country, whether it came to in the workplace or outside the workplace, and whether that was with respect to women's rights or with respect to racial minority or religious minority rights. And in the last few years, we've seen a rollback through the actions of our United States Supreme Court on many of those fronts. But we're also starting, and what's more alarming is we're starting, as we get into these culture war spaces and what's valuable from a cultural perspective, we start losing sense of individual rights. So, on the social justice end, I think one of the ways that ended up playing out was on reproductive rights as an argument overall. And there certainly was a overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court. And look, I think, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this from my ACLU peeps or, those that are kind of in my supporter base, but I think there's a lot of folks out there who have sincerely held beliefs and oppose abortion in all forms at any time because of those sincerely held beliefs. I'm not one of those people, right? But I understand that they have that view. The issue that I have is when you start talking about government regulations and restrictions on somebody else's right to do something, you start getting into a slippery slope. At that point, there's no limit to what you can do. So for the longest time, these arguments were predicated and revolved around individual privacy rights. And now it's shifted beyond individual privacy into something else. The same thing happens in the workplace. And we're still looking at a society where women are making $0.75 of what men are making in the workplace. That's not been addressed. We're looking at the highest rate in the state of Nevada, one of the only demographics where you're seeing a rising prison population is for women. It's one of the only demographics where you've seen an increase, and the increase is specifically for women prisoners. So you start to look at the systemic issues as a result of that. It's why whenever I talk about policing, I always talk about things systemically. I'm not talking about individual police officers because it's not that I don't care about them. I'm sure they're great human beings like every other profession. It's a job. But the system is broken because we criminalize things oftentimes that end up leading people into a state where they're incarcerated. And we have these different narratives that end up existing that crime is on the rise. Well, what kind of crime is on the rise? We don't have the follow-up question. We get these 10-second sound bites. And so when we start looking at the women's population within prison, we should be asking the question, why? We look at the overall indicators of why. If you criminalize things like drug possession and you recognize that there's substance abuse issues, is that the best use of public resources? So we recognize that those numbers are rising. Addiction is on the rise as a whole, and substance abuse is on the rise as a whole. In many instances, because that's the nature of what work environments have become. Coping mechanisms, and up until a few years ago, was heavily stigmatized there. We also see the same issues that end up becoming pervasive around things like paid family leave and maternity, right? People being forced to be in a position where they're having to choose between a career and their family. And one of the more alarming indicators, I think, is that during COVID, we had many opportunities to reset our ideology. We had the ability to say, now we have a work from home environment. You can do work in many instances. Unless you're, working in a brick and mortar building, a lot of folks can work from home. How do we figure out ways to facilitate that? But I've seen some organizations, and candidly, this includes my own, that had, in my opinion, useless discussions about rigid schedules and like making sure people are there from a specific time and leave at a specific time. If I was working a retail shop or running a retail shop, that makes sense, or a restaurant, but we're working around the clock on different issues. I don't care if my team works from home or they work from a coffee shop, as long as they get their work done. You can't use the same metrics as you did before, where simply showing up is the standard. There needs to be a performative evaluation for how you're measuring success. And so I think those issues are still continuing to kind of roll up, but they're hitting across the board. I will say one thing we're also noticing here in the state of Nevada is we have a majority, our legislature has a majority of women that are state legislators, and that's something to celebrate. I wish it was the same thing with the lobbying corps here that gets paid in a way that legislators don't. So while we continue to push that and representation matters, lobbyists run those buildings, and I know that because I'm part of that system as well, right? But the lobbying corps is overwhelmingly men still. We're seeing a rising number of women, especially women of color, who are entering into that field, but it's still not enough. And so, the back channel and ways of where data evaluation, things like that, are still not fully up to par. Even when we look at how organizations are marketing pay equity, and they say we have our average pay is this, and 63% of women of our organization is comprised of women, but they're not correlating what the actual pay is for women and what the disparity is there. And my agency in New York used to do that all the time. It drove me nuts because I'm like, stop trying to tell one story when this is really a series of stories there that actually would highlight disparities if you were truthful.
That's such a great point and an interesting observation. I feel like you've got boots on the ground. You're so in it. And what you've highlighted is that we get high-level headlines, right? And we get a certain narrative. And the narrative is really nothing without the context. So you've mentioned that ACLU is a nonpartisan organization. You are out there fighting for everyone's liberties and rights. And it's almost, I don't have the word for it. It's so overwhelming how many issues you could be attacking or choosing where to focus your efforts and your resources and your team. I don't doubt that you're getting just random calls day in, day out. Here's what happened to me. Here's what happened to me. Here's what's actually going on in my work environment, as opposed to what we're being told mid-COVID or post-COVID, what work environments are now. So with all that said, what do you think our listeners could be paying attention to as we head into this next, 2023, 2024, year, and particularly because of the election? Again, this is a nonpartisan organization, but so much of our narratives are driven by a bipartisan system.
There's a few different things I think that are critical. First and foremost, for anybody who's listening, if you don't already have a relationship with your local elected, regardless of whether or not that's your state assembly person or your state senator, contact them and see if they respond. I always encourage that because they should know who you are. And there's power in that. And most of the time, folks will say, like, what's happening in the U.S. Senate or what's happening in the U.S. Congress. Your local politics matter so much more. I often get hit up to ask me to weigh in on things like the conflict in Israel and Palestine. It's not that I don't have opinions like everybody does about everything, but my impact, I'm not changing or solving for peace in the Middle East through my position, right? So like devote your attention to where it's relevant. For every listener, they're going to care at least about one issue. It's important for you to have a conversation with your local or your state elected about what that issue is that matters. There's a few things that are on the horizon. I think the United States Supreme Court has made no secret about what their intention is during the next term. They're looking to do things like overturn marriage equality, to potentially engage or allow in states to criminalize in activities along those lines. They've already rolled back affirmative action protections, which, in my opinion, we're going to see the dangers of that a few years down the road. But right now, if you're a woman or a minority that's, paying attention to the elections, listen to the narratives about DEI initiatives and attacks on diversity as a whole, and where they're coming from. There's a artificial push right now for a meritocracy, and everything should be merit-based. That's a goofy argument in and of itself, because if that was the case, the people making those arguments would never have been in the position to be able to articulate them. They're not qualified to make those arguments. They haven't worked for it or earned it. Many of them simply came from backgrounds that allowed them those opportunities, and they have the gall to come back and tell people that they should not have those opinions and everything should be based on merits. If we had a meritocracy, there would be nobody, or at least a majority of Congress would probably be gone right now. And the majority of folks who have served as president probably wouldn't have. So it's an artificial argument, but they're dog whistles to people who are angry. And generally, angry voters turn out the same way that inspired voters do. So figure out, what the messages are and the issues that align. I think the presidential race is going to get a lot of attention. My expectation is it's going to be a Trump-Biden race. It's not my favorite overall. I think that's for a lot of folks. But I think when we start listening to the rhetoric that's coming out, there's a lot of other important races. Judicial races become important. A couple years ago, we had like a sweep of women who became judges in Clark County and in the state of Nevada, which was awesome to see. We're going to also see that here. And we're going to start hearing more and more attacks. If you're a Nevada-based listener, you're going to start hearing more attacks on our state's Equal Rights Amendment, which was passed in 2022 and is the most sweeping equal rights amendment in the country, designed to protect the rights of all, so that you can't deny or discriminate against somebody based on a characteristic that's covered there. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of culture war attacks on the ERA, and they're going to attempt to paint things like an equal rights amendment as being problematic. But I think that's important for listeners to be able to look at it. It's 3 lines, right? Like, I think a lot of times people are like, "Oh, I don't care about politics." You can either be at the table or on the menu. There's not a third option. And so even if you don't care about politics and politicians care about you. And regardless of what happens, they're going to impact your life. So despite the fact, and I have family members that are the same way, I don't want to talk about politics. I don't care about politics. You care about your paycheck. You care about your quality of life. You care about the amount of time you're going to be able to spend with your family. You care about whether or not you can pay your mortgage. And until you care about politics, you have no input in any of those matters because you're avoiding the issue. And the issue is going to exist regardless of whether or not you participate or not.
I want to take a little side journey here. Can we talk about the ERA? I feel like that
Would love to.
both from a state level and also as a national level, because that has been a decades long saga. And I guess I'm still, and I'm probably naive, I've watched several documentaries on it. I'm still confused how there's this argument against it, because it seems, when just even in the name, equal rights, it seems very like, yeah, that sounds delightful. So can you walk us through that history? I know we didn't intend for this to necessarily go down that path, but I think a lot of people probably have questions, and especially our generation, because ERA really got started before our time.
Yeah, and that's what laid the framework. Like if we go back, 4 or 5 decades ago now, and even longer than that, there's pushes consistently to ensure equality, equal rights for all people. Now, the categories for that have changed over the years. So many states and the federal government created protections for specific classes of individuals. A lot of those were based on things like race or gender or religion, but there was different levels of scrutiny applied. It wasn't always the highest level of scrutiny. So when you're suing someone for discrimination, generally the government, you're suing the government for a discriminatory policy, there's these different levels of different standards that they apply. For things historically like religion, race, or depending on what type of issue it was, there would be the highest level of scrutiny that's called strict scrutiny, which means that in order for the government's regulation to survive, it would have to be narrowly tailored to fulfilling a compelling government interest using the least restrictive means possible. So it's a really, really high standard to satisfy. In the middle, which is called intermediate scrutiny, was classifications that included gender. And what that would allow was for a government regulation to survive, it would have to be an important government interest that was substantially related to the actual aim that was there. So the standard was slightly lower. What the ERA sought to do at the federal level was to include and make sure that some of these middling levels of classifications, which included gender, were bumped up so that a strict scrutiny analysis would apply anytime that there's a discriminatory policy in place. That might mean a discriminatory workforce policy, or something that allowed for difference in things like pay by a government contractor, or something else that allowed for that sort of division, or a preclusion of individual based on their gender to be able to enter in a specific type of work unless it survived that highest level of scrutiny. So what ends up happening is the federal government, there's all these pushes. Well, in the state of Nevada, we had some of these protections in state law, but it was not in our state constitution. Our state constitution, much like the federal level, our state constitution is our highest layer of law within the state of Nevada. So a few years back, there was a push that ended up before voters to create a statewide equal rights amendment to the Nevada Constitution. Our statewide ERA is comprehensive because not only does it include gender as one of those characteristics, it also is one of the first of its kind because it includes gender identity as a qualifying characteristic there. And folks continue to equate sex, gender, and gender identity because oftentimes they don't know the difference, or they're intentionally trying to misinform people and say that they're all the same. For a lot of people that oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, they don't believe that someone's gender identity could be distinct from their biological sex. They only now believe in their biological sex, which is a new argument that they employed in the last few years. It was much the same way. It's another culture war argument to basically deny those who may be trans or maybe gender nonconforming their ability to participate meaningfully or be free from discrimination. And so they continue to make those pushes. But they did the same thing a few years ago when they talked about censorship. It wasn't a genuine argument. They said that we can't have snowflakes or coddle anyone in America, so We have to allow Confederate monuments to stay up. We need to make sure that we're accurately telling the story of history. And just a couple years later, they're trying to ban books from schools because they think reading a book about gay folks will make your kid gay. So it's the, don't say gay approach and a lot of these bad ideas come from Florida. I'll just call it what it is. I mean, fortunately, that's the reality of the situation. It's like the mirror here. It's like, if you want a bad idea, go to Florida. You're probably going to find it somewhere there, regardless of what side you're on. There's a high chance they'll emanate from that region.
I second that.
Yeah,
I apologize to any of our listeners in Florida.
But at the end of the day, the Equal Rights Amendment in the state, because now it's been put in our state constitution, there's the ability to issue legal challenges when there is discrimination. And all of these characteristics and classes that are protected by our state ERA now have risen to a level that a strict scrutiny analysis would apply. At the federal level, there's still challenges with its enactment. And so for those that are in Nevada, in my opinion, you're better protected than you are if you're in another state that doesn't have those. And part of the reason why it hasn't been enacted is because there are elements that don't believe that strict scrutiny analysis should apply on things like race, on things like gender, on things like sex, on things like gender identity. There's simply not a cognition of that. Many of those folks want to preserve and protect the status quo. They don't think that there should be advocacy at a higher level, and they don't think that we should have smarter conversations. They would prefer that we have no conversations so we can maintain existing inequities.
I appreciate that. Dive into that conversation. And I will say that as a mother of two daughters, looking at where we wanted to raise our kids, it was a conversation and looking at states where and I flat out said it, I couldn't live in a state where our children were second-class citizens because of their gender. It's really, really something that's important to me because I think it kind of trickles, right? I think a lot of people go, oh, that's not the case. And we see it. It spreads. So I appreciate that. I have just one other question because I think we're seeing it. It seems like it's a buzzword and I see it in connection with ACLU. So I want to give you kind of the chance maybe to clarify. I see ACLU tied in with what's been deemed the woke agenda. I'm still not really clear on what the woke agenda is, but I think we're going to see a little bit more of that. Would you mind maybe demystifying what that means? And I think it probably just stems back to what the ACLU really stands for. But I think it's good for our listeners to have that ACLU's perspective when they're reading these
every time
topics.
Every time I've dealt with one of our haters, they'll say like, oh, you all are, we're anti-woke. And when I tell them like woke really, we started talking about the concept of it, it meant black. That was the colloquial phrase that folks were using in the community. So when they say they're, criticizing it, they really mean they didn't want that. And then extended, I think, beyond that, right? So now it's this other kind of combination of like, yeah, we're trying to advance rights for all people. We do believe there are people who are trans, and we believe there are people who are gender nonconforming. We believe there are gay people, and we believe that they should have equal rights. We believe black folks and brown folks and people who are immigrants. We believe people who are women and, anybody else who might not necessarily fit this monolith of what some folks want America to look like should be considered and should be treated with dignity and respect, should not be abused and treated, to your point, like second-class citizens, should not be ignored or rejected simply because of their background or their appearance. And somehow that's turned certain portions of society into now they view themselves as the other. By 2042, we're expecting that people of color will comprise a majority of the United States. That's a threat to the existing standards and systems that have long existed, because those standards and systems have allowed for a specific class of individuals to maintain political and, more importantly, probably economic power. Politics and economics is inherently intertwined, whether that means we're looking at systemic issues from years ago like redlining, or the ability for folks to even enter into the marketplace and not be prohibited through things like restrictions on occupational licensing. We live in the fourth most licensed state in the country in Nevada, and there's barriers to entering into the workforce. So when folks say, you're pushing a woke agenda, you can call it whatever you want, right? But at the end of the day, it's a dog whistle to say we're anti-woke, which means, in my opinion, when someone's saying that they're anti-woke and they're taking pride in it, really what they're saying is like, no, we're fine with racism. We're fine with being sexist. We're fine with discriminating against other individuals because we think we're smarter than that. And they're really not. I think it's, an intellectually inferior argument for someone to say that they're anti-woke. I recognize that there is now a premium in America across the country. There is a premium on sounding stupid and taking pride in being stupid. And I don't make any qualms about that. They look for the lowest level of talking point to try to push this narrative that they're somehow unifying America by othering groups that are not in line with what they do. It's why in places like Douglas County right now, it's a smaller community in northern Nevada, there's been pushes by their school board to target trans students. There's like 4 or 5 trans students in their school district. And rather than focus on improving academic indicators, they're engaging in this, again, culture war lunacy to try to push this narrative that, hey, we're going to go after these kids because, they're part of the problem and we can't have anybody doing this. It's the same way that they have they've fundamentally opposed abortion. And then when you recognize that there's a new mom who needs help and she doesn't have health insurance, she doesn't have basic care, no ability to feed her child, they would rather criminalize that woman than see to it that she's receiving any level of assistance, because their only concept is figuring out ways to make life more difficult. So the anti-woke crowd is the pro-stupid crowd. And, that's what I'll say 10 times out of 10. I'm always happy to debate anybody, about any of these issues, but they'll never do it because the only thing they can do is parrot, again, very simple talking points. And there's a cheat code for all of them. They pretend as if they value privacy and they don't like the government. And they're the biggest beneficiaries of what the government's done. And they don't care about privacy. They just care about their own interests. So it's totally disingenuous. If the word woke means, yeah, we're pro-equality for everyone, guilty.
Well, and I think it leads to question buzzwords. There's a reason buzzwords are out there, and I think you hit on it. It's kind of that lowest talking point, right? And so any buzzword from any side of the aisle, question those buzzwords, look into the origin. What does it really mean? Don't define yourself by buzzwords and catchphrases by our very polarized system, right?
I can put it in perspective how polarized the system is, right? If we talk about Donald Trump and we say that, he has, compared to all the folks I've represented over the years, you rarely run into people who are hemmed up in legal issues in different states and at the federal level in different communities. So once you start hitting those states, it's problematic. And I'll be attacked for being woke, right? But I even maintain at this point that Donald Trump maintains a presumption of innocence because that's how our justice system works. The issue that I have is that the same presumption that I suggest that he has, they're not willing to give to any black person that's murdered by a rogue police officer or any police officer engaged in that kind of work. They will instead vilify the person and say that they deserved it. And they don't understand their own hypocrisy. I've also reached a point where I've stopped trying to convince them that their arguments are ideologically problematic or that they're engaging in hypocrisy, because at some point you have to realize that there is no attempt to engage in meaningful dialogue on some of their end. They're simply trying to push division because it's a way to maintain power. And the more we attempt to coddle that and not root it out, not call it out, not have those honest conversations and not say, hey, your position is problematic and here's why it's goofy, we end up taking ourselves back 2 steps because we're focused on using our own standards for how we think the world should work to reach them when they have no interest in reaching those same standards.
I think a lot of the things you've said have either directly mentioned the word fear or, threat. And I think some of this, the root cause is a scarcity mindset, right? And we're talking about liberties and rights. There's people out there, there's folks who think something more for somebody else means something less for me. And that's not the case, right? More for everybody is more for everybody. And so also when you're talking about this presumption of innocence and being involved in your own community rather than focusing on a really high level and thinking about changing, the powers that be and those that are sitting in the highest offices in the land. Look at what's going on in your own community and say, okay, in my own community, in my neighborhood, can I apply this, right? Can I have that lens where I can see more for everyone is more for everyone? So to the extent that's kind of a wrap up, I appreciate all of your thoughts. We appreciate all of your thoughts. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
If listeners want more information, where can you direct them?
If you visit ACLUNV.org, there's some information on that. Depends on like the audience size. We generally tell people to follow us on social. Our team has a lot of fun, creative young folks. So we're on IG, we're on Facebook, we're on TikTok. Jordan Chamiso, who's our digital comms person, puts out really good TikTok content. So for those that are TikTokers or, Instagrammers, check us out. One of the things that I always like to tell people is we're a membership-driven organization. So if you just visit our website, aclunv.org, for as low as $5 per year, you can become an ACLU member. And look, you might not agree with us on everything. I get it. I don't necessarily agree with anybody on everything either. But it's important for people to recognize that we are an organization that's fiercely devoted to protecting their rights, even when they're disagreeable. And we love to have new members. We love to hear from folks. And so we have contact features on there. Reach out. Try to reach out before you run into a legal issue. So we, get to know you in advance. But we always have initiatives there. And we're always looking for ways to improve our community, regardless of whether or not, that's the story that certain politicians want to tell, and that's the reality of where we are.
This overview is for informational purposes only. We might include some projections, and those should not be relied upon for the purpose of investing. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and any investments we mention are meant for accredited investors only. And any offer can only be considered upon review of a prospectus and relevant offering documentation. So please keep this in mind as we move through this overview, and remember that these are our opinions only.